There's a silent epidemic spreading across the modern world, not of viruses but of thoughts. Anxious thoughts, negative thoughts, catastrophic thoughts. Millions of people wake up every day with a war waging inside their own heads. And for many, the first line of defense is therapy. One method in particular has risen to the top. It's structured, it's scientific, and it's backed by decades of clinical results. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is praised as the most effective modern tool to treat anxiety, depression, and emotional distress. But here's the twist no one tells you. It might not be modern at all. What if I told you that the core ideas behind CBT were not discovered in a research lab, but in the dusty ruins of Athens, beneath the columns of ancient Rome? Or scribbled in the private diary of a man who ruled an empire? What if the therapy that saves minds today is simply a rediscovery of a wisdom forged by ancient philosophers who faced not clients in offices, but tyrants, exile, and death? This isn't about replacing science. This is about seeing what science has only recently begun to prove was already known. According to Ryan Holiday, Stoicism is not some esoteric philosophy. It's a practical framework for doing the hard things, especially when you don't feel like doing them. And that's exactly what we're about to explore. CBT and Stoicism share the same bones, the same breath. They are not rivals, they are reflections. One shaped by modern psychology, the other by the forge of ancient resilience. CBT tells us that we suffer not from events, but from our thoughts about those events. The Stoics said the same 2,000 years earlier. And they didn't just say it, they lived it. Welcome to the Stoic Lighthouse. Our mission is simple: to cut through the mental fog of modern life using the timeless clarity of ancient thought. If you've ever felt like your mind is working against you, stick around. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join the thousands learning how to take back control, one thought at a time. In this video, we're going to put modern therapy on trial, not to tear it down, but to trace its roots. We'll look at the structure of CBT and hold it up next to the writings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, and others. And what you'll see isn't just similarity, it's identity. These methods aren't cousins, they're twins. But more importantly, we'll show you how this realization can set you free. Because if the same tools that therapists use today were once held by philosophers, without degrees, without offices, without any modern system, then maybe you don't need perfect conditions to begin healing. Maybe you don't need permission to start mastering your mind. All you need is to remember what was forgotten. Let's begin. Number 1. How modern therapy was built on ancient stones. To understand the hidden bond between modern psychology and ancient philosophy, we need to pop the hood on one of the most respected and widely used therapies of our time, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Developed in the 1960s by psychiatrist Dr. Aaron Beck, CBT was a game changer. As he worked with patients suffering from depression, Dr. Beck noticed something that contradicted everything the field assumed. It wasn't the events of their lives making them miserable. It was the way they interpreted those events. That insight sparked a quiet revolution in mental health care. But what if it wasn't an innovation at all, but a rediscovery? At the core of CBT is a model that's elegant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Dr. Beck called it the cognitive model. It works like this. First, there's a situation, something external. Then automatically our brain generates a thought about that situation. That thought produces an emotional response. And that emotional response drives our behavior. In other words, it's not the situation itself that causes distress. It's the thought we attach to it. CBT teaches us to interrupt this loop, to pause, to examine, to challenge those automatic interpretations and replace them with more balanced, rational ones. According to Dr. Aaron Beck, The interpretation of a situation, rather than the situation itself, determines how a person feels and behaves. Let's bring that to life. Imagine you're at work and you get a vague message from your boss. Can you stop by my office at 4 p.m.? That's the situation, neutral, no emotion attached. But your mind doesn't treat it that way. In a flash, a thought appears. I must have messed something up. I'm in trouble. I'm probably getting fired. That's not a fact. That's a narrative. And your body reacts. Anxiety, racing heart, restless thoughts. You can't focus. You brace for the worst. And yet, nothing has happened. Just a sentence, just an email. CBT helps us catch that moment. Instead of letting the emotion take over, it teaches us to interrogate the thought. Is there any real evidence I'm in trouble? Could this meeting be about something else entirely? What are the other, more reasonable explanations? Through this process, we begin to rewrite the story. Not by denying reality, but by seeing it more clearly. CBT gives us the tools to shift our internal narrative, and in doing so, shift our emotional state. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because 2,000 years ago, long before psychology had a name, another voice was saying the exact same thing. According to Epictetus, it is not events that disturb people, it is their judgments about them. The parallels aren't accidental. The architecture of CBT, the very blueprint that helps people regain control over their emotional lives, mirrors, almost word for word, the teachings of the Stoics. And not just Epictetus. Marcus Aurelius, in his private writings, reflected daily on his own judgments and reactions, trying to strip them down to the bare reality beneath the emotion. Seneca warned against jumping to conclusions and believing our first impressions. Chrysippus, one of the earliest architects of Stoic logic, laid the foundation for cognitive restructuring centuries before Beck coined the term. Even modern authors have taken notice. According to Donald Robertson, psychotherapist and author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, CBT owes more to ancient Stoicism than most people realize. The early pioneers of therapy, like Albert Ellis, openly admitted their debt to the Stoic philosophers. William Burvine, in his modern classic A Guide to the Good Life, goes even further. He doesn't just acknowledge the link, he uses Stoic principles as mental strategies for everyday life, from managing setbacks to resisting envy and anger. The bridge between CBT and Stoicism is more than philosophical, it's functional. Both offer practical tools, both start with the same core truth. We are not the passive victims of our emotions, we are the authors of our interpretations. And if we learn to edit the script, we can transform the story of our lives. This chapter isn't just a comparison, it's a revelation. Because when you understand how modern therapy echoes ancient philosophy, something clicks. Maybe the path to mental clarity doesn't always begin in an office, but in a scroll, in a notebook, in a conversation between your present self and the thinkers who walked this path long before you. And that realization is where the real therapy begins. Number 2, the source code, one sentence that rewrote history. Imagine for a moment that the most powerful therapy technique of our time is just an echo, a modern repetition of an ancient insight, whispered not from a leather couch in a clinical office, but from a dusty schoolyard in ancient Greece or a philosopher's bench in the Roman Empire. One sentence, only a few words long, that has quietly shaped not just one field, but two entirely different eras. And it didn't come from a doctor. It came from a man who was once a slave. Epictetus never held a degree, never published academic papers, never worked in a clinic, but what he did hold, and fiercely, was the belief that freedom begins in the mind. His teachings would later become the beating heart of Stoic practice, and unknowingly, the philosophical backbone of modern cognitive therapy. And it all comes down to this one principle. Epictetus taught, It is not things themselves that disturb us, but the judgments we form about those things. Let that sink in. This is not a motivational quote, it's a philosophical earthquake. Over 2,000 years before Dr. Aaron Beck developed the cognitive model, Epictetus was teaching students to separate raw events from their internal interpretations. What CBT calls a situation, the Stoics called a fact. What CBT labels automatic thoughts, the Stoics called judgments. To. And what CBT tries to reshape through cognitive restructuring, Stoicism does through the practice of withholding assent, refusing to blindly believe the first impression that arises. But Epictetus was not alone. Marcus Aurelius, perhaps the most unlikely philosopher of all, a Roman emperor, returned to this principle almost obsessively. In his meditations, written not for the public but for himself, Marcus trains his mind again and again to see the world as it is, stripped of his emotional overlays. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." That's not just ancient wisdom, that's a roadmap. In Stoic training, one of the first disciplines was examining phantasiae, impressions. When something happened, the Stoic would pause and ask, "Is this a fact, or is this just how I feel about it?" This is the ancient version of challenging cognitive distortions. They didn't call it therapy, they called it philosophy, but the function was nearly identical. According to Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school and one of its most important minds, the soul is affected not by the things themselves, but by the meanings we assign to them. Chrysippus was building a system of logic that treated thoughts like math, capable of being tracked, tested, and revised. This wasn't vague mysticism, it was precise, structured self-examination. Fast forward 20 centuries, and you find the same ideas, repackaged and renamed in CBT. What Beck developed as the cognitive triad, the idea that our view of ourselves, the world, and the future shapes our emotions, is practically identical to the Stoic division between what is up to us and what is not. Modern therapists help patients reframe negative beliefs. Ancient Stoics trained their students to adopt a cosmic perspective, to zoom out, see the bigger picture, and place their pain in a wider, often humbling context. In both systems, the goal is freedom, not from pain, but from unnecessary suffering. And it didn't stop in antiquity. The bridge extends to our time. According to Donald Robertson, Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy and a key figure in CBT's evolution, was deeply inspired by Epictetus. He often quoted him in his sessions. This wasn't accidental, it was intentional. Modern therapy is built on Stoic stone. Ryan Holiday, who helped reignite Stoic philosophy for millions, puts it simply, the Stoics weren't trying to feel better, they were trying to be better, and that right there is the divergence. CBT helps us feel better by shifting how we interpret the world. Stoicism aims even higher, not just peace of mind, but virtue of character. This chapter is more than historical alignment. It's a reminder that tools to master the mind were never locked away in academic circles. They were always accessible, always available, and they were written not in textbooks, but in the fire of adversity. Number 3, the smoking gun. 3 techniques that prove the truth. It's one thing to say that Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy share the same philosophy, but it's another to put their tools side by side and realize they are practically identical, not similar, identical, structured exercises, proven methods, centuries apart, and yet mirror images of one another. This isn't philosophy anymore, it's forensics, it's the smoking gun. Let's begin with the first piece of evidence, the thought record, a cornerstone of CBT. It's a tool therapists use to help patients externalize their internal chaos. You take a moment of distress, write down the situation, the thought it triggered, the emotion it sparked, and then evaluate that thought. Was it true? Was it distorted? Can it be replaced by something more balanced? This is the essence of cognitive restructuring, turning the spotlight inward, catching your automatic reactions in the act, and interrogating them until they break. Now enter Marcus Aurelius. Each night, alone in his war tent, surrounded by the silence of the battlefield, he sat with a candle and a journal, and did the very same thing. He didn't call it therapy. He called it philosophy. But the structure is unmistakably familiar. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Tonight I remind myself I will encounter the arrogant, the jealous, the ungrateful, not because the world is broken, but because they are, and I am no less flawed." He was logging events, naming the emotions they stirred, then reinterpreting them through reason, virtue, and a greater perspective. That's not journaling. That's Stoic CBT. Long before therapy rooms and clipboard checklists, Marcus was tracking and transforming his inner world with pen and parchment. It was a thought record with a crown. The second technique, exposure therapy. In modern psychology, this means facing your fears in controlled doses. A person afraid of social situations might begin with eye contact, then small talk, then public speaking. Over time, the fear shrinks. You disarm the monster by walking straight toward it. The Stoics had a version of this too. They called it voluntary discomfort, and no one lived this principle more vividly than Seneca. Though one of Rome's wealthiest men, Seneca deliberately dressed in coarse clothing, ate bland meals, and slept on the floor. Not because he was punishing himself, but because he was training his nervous system to realize that discomfort wasn't death. Seneca encouraged, "Set aside a number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself, 'Is this the condition I feared?'" It was rehearsal, exposure. He faced the worst-case scenario before life could throw it at him. Stoic training was not about escaping adversity, it was about inoculating the soul. And finally, the third technique, reframing catastrophes. In CBT, this is called decatastrophizing. A patient says, "If I mess up this meeting, my career is over." The therapist gently challenges them, "Is that really true? Will your life fall apart from one mistake?" The goal is not to deny the importance of the moment, but to right-size it, to gain clarity. The Stoics mastered this long before the term existed. One of their most profound techniques was the view from above, a mental practice where you imagine yourself rising high above the earth, looking down on your problems, your city, your country, the planet itself. Suddenly, what felt monumental seems tiny, temporary, humbling. Marcus Aurelius practiced this often, especially during moments of pressure. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "See the whole, not just your pain. Look down from the stars and realize, this too shall pass." But the root of this perspective goes even further back. The pre-Stoic philosopher Anaximander was among the first to imagine Earth not as a flat plane, but as a body floating in space, a cosmic dot in the vast unknown. The Stoics absorbed this vision, not to escape reality, but to put it into scale. Modern therapy helps people zoom out from their mental storms. The Stoics built that zoom lens 2,000 years ago. 3 tools, 3 techniques: thought journaling, voluntary exposure, perspective reframing. In CBT, they are clinical exercises. In Stoicism, they are spiritual disciplines. But they achieve the same goal: freedom from the false stories that run our lives. As William Burvine puts it, the Stoics were the original mental hackers. They figured out that if you can master your perception, you can master your peace. And now, science is simply catching up. Number 4, the therapist on your shelf. How Stoicism became a superpower. There's a silent belief embedded in our culture that therapy is something external, that healing requires appointments, credentials, prescriptions, that the tools for emotional clarity live behind office doors or inside expensive programs. But what if that belief is false? What if the most powerful therapist you'll ever meet doesn't wear a white coat or ask you to lie on a couch, but waits quietly on your bookshelf? Here's what modern therapy rarely tells you. You already own the tools. You just haven't been taught how to use them. CBT, for all its brilliance, is a system built on structure and evidence. It offers techniques. It delivers results. But what it sometimes lacks is soul. It can teach you how to think differently, but it doesn't always tell you why you should. It can reduce suffering, but does it help you live with courage? Does it help you become someone worthy of admiration, even in private? This is where Stoicism becomes a superpower. According to Donald Robertson, CBT helps people overcome emotional problems. Stoicism offers a whole philosophy of life, a moral compass for everything. Where CBT ends, Stoicism begins. Because while modern therapy helps us feel better, Stoicism invites us to become better. It's not just about symptom reduction, it's about character elevation. The Stoics weren't interested in comfort. They were obsessed with virtue. They believed that the true goal of life was arete, excellence of soul, and that philosophy was the training ground for becoming unshakable. Marcus Aurelius didn't write meditations to feel good. He wrote them to be good. He wrote them to resist ego, envy, anger, distraction. And every night he returned to the page, not as a ruler but as a student of his own mind. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Seneca did the same. His letters to Lucilius were more than correspondence. They were blueprints, every letter a small manual for facing grief, poverty, betrayal, and death, not with panic, but with principle. His advice was raw, uncompromising, and personal. It wasn't therapy, it was truth. And then there's Epictetus, the philosopher who had every excuse to be bitter, born a slave, crippled, exiled. But instead of folding, he built a philosophy that transcended pain. He didn't wait for someone to save him. He became the architect of his own rescue. Epictetus taught, you may not control the circumstances, but you can always control your response. These thinkers, Marcus, Seneca, Epictetus, weren't writing for classrooms. They were writing for survival. And now, centuries later, their words are waiting for you. Their scrolls have become pages, their schools have become shelves, and all you have to do is open them. Modern thinkers have followed their lead. Ryan Holiday's The Daily Stoic turned these ancient ideas into morning rituals for millions. Jocko Willink fused Stoicism with military discipline. Sharon Labelle gave Epictetus a poetic voice for modern ears. William Burvine mapped out a modern roadmap for ancient resilience, and James Stockdale, a US fighter pilot shot down and tortured in Vietnam, credited his survival to one thing: Epictetus. James Stockdale once said, "The only thing you can control is your internal dialogue." That wasn't a metaphor, it was his lifeline. The truth is, therapy is a powerful gift, and for many, a necessary one. But Stoicism gives you a rare form of independence, a way to train your own mind between sessions, a way to process pain when no one is around, a way to live with clarity when life refuses to play fair. And unlike a therapist's schedule, the Stoics are available 24/7 for free. You don't need permission to begin. You don't need credentials to practice. You just need a willingness to look inward and the courage to keep showing up every day, because once you see Stoicism for what it truly is, not a theory but a training, you realize something life-changing. You're not broken, you're untrained, and training starts now. We began this journey with a question. What if the therapy transforming lives today, the therapy backed by science and practiced around the world, was simply a modern translation of ancient wisdom? And now, standing at the end, the answer is undeniable. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for all its modern polish and clinical precision, is not a new invention. It's a rediscovery, a return, a revival of ideas that once echoed through the streets of Athens and the halls of Rome. And that realization changes everything, because we've now seen how the core model of CBT, that our thoughts, not events, create our emotional reality, is the very principle Epictetus dedicated his life to teaching. We've watched Marcus Aurelius record his own internal struggles long before the concept of a thought record existed. We've seen how Seneca practiced exposure to poverty, just as CBT uses graded exposure to treat fear. We've watched ancient thinkers reframe crises through cosmic perspective, a technique that modern therapists now call decatastrophizing. Each technique, each tool, each truth, not invented, remembered. According to Ryan Holiday, these ideas have survived, not because they are old, but because they are true. That's the point. The human mind hasn't changed as much as we like to think. We still wrestle with fear, pride, grief, and insecurity, the same way they did 2,000 years ago. And what worked for them still works for us. But this isn't just a revelation about therapy, it's a revolution in responsibility, because once you understand that the greatest minds in history used philosophy as their self-therapy, once you see Marcus Aurelius journaling, Epictetus questioning his thoughts, Seneca confronting worst-case scenarios, you realize something radical. You don't have to wait to heal. You don't need to be perfect to start. You can begin today with the thoughts you challenge, the words you speak, the values you live. Right now, in this very moment, this is your superpower. Not just to feel better, but to live better. Not just to reduce suffering, but to build strength. Not just to survive emotion, but to lead it. So let me ask you, did this video surprise you? Did it shift the way you see therapy or philosophy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What Stoic technique have you used, maybe without even realizing it? What moment in this video resonated most with your journey? And if you haven't yet, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the Stoic Lighthouse. We're here to guide your mind through storms with the light of timeless clarity. Share this video with someone who's struggling, someone who thinks healing can only come from the outside. Help them realize it might already be within. And before you go, here's something you won't want to miss. In our next episode, we'll explore one of the most misunderstood and powerful Stoic ideas of all time, the Stoic art of not giving a damn intelligently. What does it really mean to let go of things that don't matter without becoming cold, numb, or careless? What's the secret to building emotional armor that doesn't become a prison? We'll break the myth of apathy. We'll show you how the Stoics mastered detachment, not to escape life, but to engage with it more powerfully. So turn on notifications. You don't want to miss it. Until then, remember, as Carl Jung once said, who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. See you in the next video.